right, my friends, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. We are talking about football this week. You might be thinking, did I click on the wrong podcast? Isn't this about like American history and politics and stuff like that? Trust me when I say football has a lot to do with that stuff, and my guest today will tell you why. Today I'm talking with Jason Vuic. He is one of my favorite historians. We had him on the show a few months back. We talked about his book, The Swamp Peddlers. You may remember that. Episode 328. Go check it out. We talked about how Florida and the whole history of Florida is like one big giant real estate swindle. So that was super fun. And I want to talk with him today about his book, The Yucks. 2 years in Tampa with the losingest team in NFL history. This is about the creation of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who I know are a big successful football team now, but their original story is honestly one of the most insane things I've ever heard. I will save all those details for this conversation, but go check out all of Jason's stuff. His website, jasonvuic.com, has all of his books, and we have it linked in the episode description, so go check that out. While you're at it, check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. That is at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, also linked in the episode description. We have a lot going on for our subscribers right now. Lots of bonus episodes, live streams, video content, etc. We appreciate your support. Enjoy this conversation. Here is me and historian Jason Vuic. All right, Jason Vuic, great to see you again. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. We had a great conversation that I want to let everyone know that they can go listen to if they haven't already. You came on the show, episode 328, a show we called Selling the Dream. You and I talked a lot about your books about Florida, the Swamp Peddlers, and we talked about the Yugo car, as I remember. But you're a guy that you crank out these great history books, man. And I wanted to talk with you about the other ones you've written because we didn't get to them in the first conversation.
Sure.
But yeah, let me just say the name of this one because I think people will enjoy this. Your very detailed history on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This book is called The Yucks: 2 years in Tampa with the losingest team in NFL history. What drew you to writing about the Bucs? Because it seems like another story, and I'll just preface this by saying, it links up so well with your other stuff. I see a continuity in your work in the sense that you take these stories and connect them to much larger issues, and it seems like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers story, which I didn't know anything about, of this awful team in 1976 that lost every game, right? How much it has to do with the history of Florida and Tampa in particular. So where do we start with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? What drew you to this story in the first place?
Well, I mean, I guess beyond anything else in any kind of history or academic search for some sort of truth from the past, I'm just snarky Gen X. And so, the Yugo was awesome in its failure, and the Bucs were awesome in their failure. You know what I mean? And so for me, I just turned 50 yesterday. My life is over.
Happy belated birthday.
Right.
That's a big one that I'm looking forward to in a few years. Yeah.
It's all right. And so in the 80s, growing up in Florida, the Buccaneers were awful. Now they're great. Tom Brady, I mean, they've won 2 Super Bowls. They're the envy of most franchises now. Their defense is very good. I watched them play yesterday or two days ago when they beat the Saints. And they started the season by whooping the Cowboys. I mean, they're a very good team now, and that's not the team that I grew up with. I grew up with the team that had losing record 14 seasons in a row. They had 10 lost seasons. I think, I wrote this book 7 years ago. I think it was like 10 or 12 seasons in a row of double-digit losses.
That's beyond underdog. That's horrible, non-functioning team.
Not functioning. And there's reasons I'll explain, but I love that they were bad.
Yeah.
And Buccaneers fans love that they were bad because sometimes they won and they did have some heroically good players that persevered in spite of their crappy owner, in spite of the procession of terrible coaches and terrible general managers taking terrible picks in the draft and smart players like Bo Jackson saying, "I'm not coming." being drafted by the Bucs and saying, I'm not coming.
Mm-hmm.
And good for him. Jeff Pearlman has this, I can't wait for it. Jeff Pearlman's a great sports writer, and he's got a biography of Bo Jackson coming out soon. I can't wait, because he's one of those guys that can write such a thing. And so growing up down there, I love the awful tangerine uniforms, which I so love now. And so many people love the old Bucs uniforms. I love the old Bucko Bruce. In the 80s when people weren't great about LGBT issues, he was the gay Blade in the NFL, right? I mean,
yeah. Let's talk about Bucko Bruce, because that's one of the things that stuck out. I mean, Bucko Bruce is on the cover of your book, sort of winking out at us. There's something about this mascot that's different than almost every other sports mascot I've seen, and certainly I don't know, it's a weird subversive thing. How did Bucko Bruce come to be? Because for those who don't know, and I can use an image of Bucko Bruce for this episode, and so if everyone can see, just Google it. Bucko is Bucco, right? Bucko Bruce. He's sort of this swashbuckling character winking with a dagger in his mouth. It's sort of an odd image.
Absolutely. He kind of looks like one of the original Bee Gees, during the disco.
Yes.
Or like a slouch hat.
A Fifth Village person, or Sixth Village person, yeah.
Exactly. He looks like he's in the English Civil War with a slouch hat, when certainly those guys are brutal and at war, but they're also kind of flamboyant, you know what I mean?
That's the sexuality of this character is really playful, and that's why it's I mean, the stereotype of the NFL it would be macho, homophobic, certainly in the 70s as a stereotype, at least, of maybe the NFL and its fans, even if that stereotype isn't true. It's weird. It usually feels like there's a very strong masculine sort of, and this guy is I don't know. There's something really great about Bucko Bruce, actually.
I mean, let's go back to the beginning of the franchise. And when I started out in this book, I wanted to write about this losing team, kind of like the Bad News Bears. I was hoping, when you're an historian and you find a kernel of an idea, I've had many agents say to me, that's a great story for a bar, but where's the book? Or that's a great story for an article. Where's the book? Where's the beef? You know what I mean?
Right.
What's the larger lesson? And so I was lucky in going back to look at the original Bucs before I spoke to any football players. And we'll come back to Bucko Bruce, and I'll explain where he fits.
Yeah. Let's go. Where did the Tampa Bay Buccaneers come from, I guess? Yeah.
Okay, well, I was lucky in that I tracked down the original guy who brought NFL football to Tampa in the 1960s. In 67, Tampa had University of Tampa. And, it's not a very large school. It was a little school. It was failing in the 60s, and they started to play football. They played it for a quite a long time, and they started to put money into it, University of Tampa. And they had this run where it was a little shady. They were probably paying players, and they were, it was like, the jokes about University of Miami in the heydays of the 80s. But in the 60s, Tampa was really quite good, and they started hitting above their weight class and bringing in players. And the city got behind them and built a stadium, Tampa Stadium. Mm-hmm. So they had it was open-ended, but it was a big, I'm not going to say beautiful, but almost a pro level stadium. And they had a college team in it. And in the off season, they had nothing to do with it. They had a few concerts. Led Zeppelin had the largest open air concert in history up to that point in Tampa, Florida in the 70s. They did another show where it was lightning and raining, and the fans just rioted and laid waste to the place. But this was like the early era of the stadium show, I feel like. Yeah. Yes. And so Tampa had built a stadium, but they're only playing 5 home games to a relatively small college that locals are into, but there's no pro sports teams in Florida. Tampa's not a very big city. It's a kind of a dingy phosphate port, a cattle port. It's Florida's workshop. Tampa's port, I still think today, probably does more business than all the ports in Florida put together, because there aren't many, and they're not as deep as Tampa Bay. And Tampa was always the workshop. So it wasn't a pretty town. It was small. It didn't have a great connection to St. Petersburg. There was no sense of Tampa Bay. being
Right.
a place. Today, and I talk about this in the book, today people will say, I'm from Tampa Bay. But in 1970, these old Cuban men, and Tampa's largely a Italian, Cuban, Spanish immigrant town, they'd say to you, I'm not a fish. I don't live in Tampa Bay. Old
Yeah,
white,
right.
old waspy Protestant Midwestern retirees lived in St. Petersburg in those days. Now it's hip as hell. It's one of the coolest places in Florida for artists and bands and music. But in 1970, even earlier, it was known for its green benches of retirees, waspy Christian retirees. And across the bay was far younger of Latins. My former brother-in-law was from an old Latin tobacco family, and it's very Latin, very young, working class and gritty. And there was no Tampa Bay. And probably you put all those cities together, all those little towns around Tampa Bay, the suburbs were starting to go. So, 250,000 people, maybe. It wasn't Detroit. It wasn't Pittsburgh.
Well, what industry is there? I mean, I know cigars and tobacco you mentioned. Is that and the ports, I suppose, but like
and MacDill Air Force Base.
Okay, there you go.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that it shows you how gritty it is. I mean, Tampa was known for its strip clubs. It still is. It's America's strip club capital, not Vegas. Tampa for years was.
I had no idea. Although
look up Mons Venus. It's a famous strip club. Joe Redner is a famous local Larry Flint. I spoke to him, interviewed him for the Bucs book. He didn't have much for me, but to me, Tampa was just gritty.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Right. And so it wasn't very big. Starting in the 60s, the Miami Dolphins came in, I believe, in 66. They weren't wildly popular. Florida wasn't filling these football stadiums. They just weren't. And so Tampa has this stadium, and in like 67, a local, like a what do you call it? Not the Shriners, but one of those type JCs, the Tampa JCs, the Junior Chamber of Commerce. They decide that they're going to have a fundraiser, and they're going to try to bring in two teams from the National Football League to play a preseason game. And in those days, players didn't get extra money for preseason games. And owners got to keep whatever was made. And so they would take teams all over the country. Preseason games, every once in a while, you'll see one played in a different place.
Right.
Like in
like
Memphis.
An exhibition game or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Usually most teams play in their home fields. It's just easier in this day and age. But in those days, they all took to the road, because Birmingham, Alabama would say, we'll give you $60,000 if you bring in your teams. And the two owners would literally walk away with $30,000 checks each.
And the players don't get paid.
They didn't get paid.
Amazing.
It was just part of their salary.
Amazing. Yeah.
Right. And so games were played like in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and Phoenix and San Antonio, and, on and on and on, even Albany and Richmond, Virginia, and Savannah. And a lot of these cities were vying for a future team. Albany's not going to get one.
Why do cities want sports teams? Is the idea? I mean, it seems like that there's an economic element of it, right? I mean,
sure.
I maybe that's the obvious point, but like there's, here in Ventura, California, where I live, there's a town right nearby called Oxnard that we host the Dallas Cowboys a training camp every summer. And it's become, for like the last 10 years, just this huge event that the city seems to be very proud to promote. Bring your families. The restaurants all benefit from it as these players are everywhere around the town. It's kind of amazing. The only reason I mention it, because I'm thinking about this, is like, why do cities want sports teams? It seems like there's an economic component, but there's also like a pride element or a cohesion of the place. And it seems like a prominent thesis of your book here. Is that the Buccaneers give a kind of life to or glue to a place that was sort of a disparate region?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And Florida was always we're open for business.
Right.
Business is good. Environmental law is bad. Build whatever you want.
I just got finished watching Boardwalk Empire, which has the last season is entirely, I don't know if you watch that show, but the last season is entirely about Nucky Thompson, who's played by Steve Buscemi, and all these gangsters going down to Florida. And like,
that's right.
They're like Atlantic City guys, but they're going down to Florida because there's money to be made in alcohol, gambling, strip clubs, all the kinds of stuff that they're good at.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Tampa's trying to sell itself like all of Florida. But what I was saying is that there were cities that were really vying for NFL teams. New Orleans, Cincinnati. When the AFL and the NFL were competing, cities were trying to jump in, and the bigger your city, Seattle, some big cities.
Yeah.
And so, the smaller ones were out. Jacksonville was out in those days. Savannah was out, but Tampa was in the running. Tampa had enough people coming in. And so when these JCs set out to host a game, I tracked down and found the man who ran it, a man named Bill Markham. We became good friends. He's a really nice man. And he was he was in business at like General Cable, or he was a sales engineer. That, he wasn't a football guy. He wasn't a promoter. He liked sports like a lot of Floridians. And what he did was he figured out that I forget, I think it was like 30,000 each or something like that. He could bring in 2 teams from the NFL, and he went and got like the NFL guide and looked up the names and numbers of teams and called them on the phone and spoke to their general managers. This was in 1967.
Amazing.
I couldn't imagine, like, you and I could never get through to a GM.
I know. It's just insane.
Right?
It's like, hey, I want to bring the Los Angeles Lakers to my town in Michigan. Let's just call them up.
Yeah. And so he did. And he got the Redskins and the Falcons. They were popular teams in the South because there were really no teams in the South. The Dolphins had just started. That was the AFL. And the NFL, the Redskins were historically very racist. Their owner, George Preston Marshall, was racist. And they kind of locked up the South in terms of broadcasting. So Southerners love the Redskins, especially white Southerners.
Wow.
And they brought in the Falcons and the Redskins because A, they were popular in the South, even into Florida. And B, they were cheap because they were terrible. And so they hosted this game in this stadium. And I forget how many people showed up, but it was like 50,000 people. 45, 50,000 people. It was the largest neutral site game that year. And so suddenly people in Tampa, including this Bill Markham and the JCs, went, wait a minute, that was a charity game. And look at the people we brought in. What if we had our own team? And so at the same time, Tampa is trying to figure out how to promote a pro football team or any pro team. You have the league itself expanding. And so they were granted in the 1960s when the AFL and the NFL merged in 66, I believe. Rozelle, the commissioner of this new NFL, was able to get an antitrust exemption from Congress because, they're saying that it kills competition and it's bad. It's a big monopoly, the NFL, right? To me, it's a big monopoly, but they promised more teams. Will expand and make even more money. And in the NFL's defense, they did do that.
That's funny. I never thought about the monopoly angle on it, but I'm thinking about the labor angle on it too, of like how you get away with their the way they treat players and everything.
Well, they all have antitrust exemptions.
Yeah, right.
They all do. That's why Congress can step in at any time. When the steroid issue, that's why Congress can say, what's up with the steroids? Because the threat behind all the sports is that we could end this antitrust exemption, and then you're going to get sued, and then your leagues could be disrupted. That's the power that Congress has over the sports leagues.
Unbelievable.
Because we don't have, like in Europe, 9 leagues. We have 1. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. The NFL, the NHL, the MLB. All the sports are that way in America. Yeah. Yep.
And so at the same time that Tampa and other cities are trying to compete for teams, the league has promised, okay, fine, we get this antitrust exemption. And in 68, we're going to add 2 new teams, Cincinnati Bengals and the New Orleans Saints, one in the AFC, one in the NFC. And in 1970, we're going to add 2 more teams, but they leave it at that. And so 67 comes and the Bucs, or not Tampa shows that it could host a team. And this Bill Markham thinks, I can do this. Why am I doing this for charity events? The JC said, look, we can't handle, we'll do one more game. But this is way beyond a club, a 50,000 person football game is way beyond. This isn't a pancake dinner, to raise money. And he said, fine, I'll do it. And so he quit his job and became the most successful football promoter in America who didn't work for the NFL. Just out of the blue, a normal everyday dude starts making, he gets money to rent the stadium. He gets people to help him. He pays for all this assistance, but he ends up hosting, I think, 7 or 8 games. And some have 50, 55,000. He made money. He made really good money with investors while the city of Tampa kind of embraced him and others, the newspapers, politicians, the mayor, the governor gets involved to try to influence the NFL into the 1970s to say we're better than Seattle or we're better than Birmingham. And so it really boiled down to a small number of cities. I think Seattle was one, Birmingham, Phoenix, Orlando was involved for a little bit. One other city, Memphis, I believe. But it was pretty clear by the early 70s that Seattle and Tampa Bay were by far and away the obvious choices. Seattle, no question about it, a powerhouse of a city, industrial, West Coast. And then Tampa with its tourism. The city itself had done some really smart things. They built a brand new airport in '68. That's the same airport that's there today. And it's my favorite airport because it's so easy. They expanded a port. They built another bridge over Tampa Bay, on the way to Manatee, a second span of the Sunshine Skyway. So they were doing all this stuff to become more of an urban center while people are pouring into Florida. It's no question that Tampa Bay is one of Florida's great bright spots. And so they're given a franchise, I believe, in '74. And so that's how the Bucs came to be. Now to bring it back to Bucko Bruce quickly.
Bucko Bruce comes back.
Right here he does. I was blown away in how I'm not going to use the term amateurish, but how such big stakes were still fairly small potatoes. The Buccaneers cost $14 million, the new franchise, $14 million. In '74.
Is that a lot or a little?
No, not even then. That wasn't a lot.
Yeah, I didn't. It seemed like a little bit. Yeah, that seemed like
even
a cheap
then,
football team.
Cheap. And then the city promised all these things to fill in the stadium, to make it the sombrero, not open ended, and it turned into be 70 something. It was one of the biggest NFL arenas, and so
Where's all this money to build all these projects coming from, by the way? Is it like a growing tax base? That's what I was thinking.
Growing tax base and going into debt, knowing that it wasn't yet a monster boondoggle like some pro teams can be. You know what I mean?
Right,
in Tampa's defense, this was a pretty good deal. They already had the stadium built.
Right.
Before they ever thought about it, they'd already wasted.
Well, it seems like you're saying that the football team is kind of a piece of this this growth that's happening in Tampa,
yes.
right? And that it's kind of amazing that there's this regular dude that becomes part of what seems like kind of almost like a proof of concept, where they're sort of proving that they could host a big football team and that there's
and they did
an audience
7 or 8
for it
games,
too.
And we're all of them were good.
Right.
They didn't have one failed exhibition. They were all, some of them were bigger. I know that the first, whatever number of those, they outdrew the Miami Dolphins, who were in the AFL, which merged.
Wow.
The original Miami Dolphins couldn't fill. Matter of fact, the Dolphins came over to Tampa to play a regular season game. Instead of playing in the Orange Bowl in Miami, they got on buses and they came to Tampa. Because more people would show up in Tampa than in Miami, which is always historically fickle. Tampa generally supports its teams, win or lose. Miami.
So there's a moment for Tampa even before the Bucs get there. It seems like of excitement about football.
They were excited about soccer. The Rowdies, the Tampa Bay Rowdies. When I was a little boy, I remember them. They played Pele in the Cosmos, and they had 55,000 people watching soccer. You know what I mean? Tampa's always been supportive, maybe not to the brim, but always been a fairly supportive team. And now the Lightning in hockey, I mean, they sell out all the time. The Bucs are a hot ticket, and they always have been. And so I was amazed, though, in the beginning at how the NFL was still kind of, the TV money was just starting to roll in. The players weren't making that much money. A lot of the players in the NFL in those days were working second jobs.
Oh, insane.
A lot of them were selling insurance because they had to. A lot of them they did a lot of meet and greets at malls. The Buccaneers players into the 80s, I remember this, would go around playing charity basketball games. Like now that's in their contract. You can't even ride a motorcycle, right?
The 70s and 80s sports stories are crazy because you have these like major league players that are sort of like barely making it, and then, I mean, it reminds me of the stories that Michael Jordan is telling in that documentary, the Bulls documentary. He's talking about the Detroit Pistons and just how like these guys were all drinking beer and smoking cigarettes in the locker room. And it's just like, this is a totally different era. You talk about like the Bad News Bears.
Yeah.
I mean, what makes, besides the fact that it's a cheap team, they only have $14 million. What makes that first team, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, how does it come together as something that just ends up being so disastrous? I guess that's my question, because it seems like there's so much excitement about Tampa, and they finally put together this team and ends up losing every fucking game in the first season, which never has been achieved before or after. That seems pretty epic. Yeah.
What happens is they go and the franchise is awarded. It's a long kind of convoluted story to a man named Hugh Culverhouse.
Yes.
And Culverhouse was he was a lawyer from Alabama who was also an accountant. He had an accounting degree and a law degree. So he handled tax law, and he worked for the IRS. And he worked for the IRS as one of their main IRS heads of an office in the South, well into his career. I mean, well into his 40s, I believe. He had 2 kids, a wife. And so, this was a civil servant. I mean, he had done well, but he wasn't rich. His kids remembered living at rinky-dink houses in Jacksonville. But he learned he learned tax law and how companies could avoid taxes or file their taxes correctly, however you want to term it, and essentially taught corporations and wealthy individuals how to essentially go offshore into Florida, right? Florida was kind of America's first stop of offshore because they didn't have state income tax.
Yeah, I didn't understand any of this until I had a friend that became like a tax attorney for like major corporations, and was like, I realized that the name of the game is for them to like basically figure out ways to legally get out of paying taxes. That's the only reason to pay these accountants and attorneys. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, through the
I need one of those.
Mid to late 60s into the 70s, he went on his own, started his his own firm where he was doing tax law, and he was making money. He himself became an investor. And so this guy didn't have a lot of money, I'd say into his 40s probably, or into his late 30s, but then started to make money. But he was always leveraged, and he was notoriously cheap, right? So he would buy, various business like shopping malls in Ohio and horse farms and property in Florida and this and that and this and that. But he didn't have a lot of cash. He wasn't liquid. He was a genius at tax law. He was a genius at making money, but he was never liquid. I wouldn't say he overextended himself. He made good investments, but he didn't have a lot of cash. And he wanted to buy his way into the NFL. He didn't know anything about football. He actually bought a book one time, like The Basics of Football.
Football for dummies. Yeah.
He didn't know the rules.
Right.
And Culverhouse ended up buying the Buccaneers. And he did pay the money for a coach. He got a guy named John McKay, who had won 3 or 4 titles at Southern Cal, one of the great, like Nick Saban of his age. He was a dominant college coach, coached O.J. Simpson, coached Lynn Swann and Ron Yeri and Mike Garrett, like Heisman winners, and dominated football. And Hugh Culverhouse paid for him. And in those days, even college coaches weren't making a lot. I think John McKay was the winningest college football coach, more than Woody Hayes, more than Paterno, more than any of those guys in LA, and was athletic director as well and was making like $90,000 a year, which was a ton of money. But
yeah,
let's say today let's say it's 250, 300, 400,000 today. Nick Saban's probably making 11 million. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't that much money. And John McKay, which we could talk about, always he didn't like pro coaches. He thought they were overpaid. He thought he could do the same thing. You know, always had these snarky comments. And so Culverhouse hired him. Bear Bryant was from Alabama, the great coach. And Bear Bryant, he wanted Bryant. Bryant didn't want to leave Alabama. Told Culverhouse, fellow Alabaman. Culverhouse is, I think the business school at Alabama is Culverhouse School of Business, you know. And he asked Bear Bryant, and Bear Bryant's good friend was John McKay. And he suggested John McKay, and that was it. So he paid the money for McKay. He gave him a house and a car and a driver and property and guarantees against inflation and all these little, you know, insurance policies, all these things that he hardly had to pay for himself to bring in this good coach. But besides that, he didn't pay anyone anything. And he squeezed Tampa once he got the team because Tampa had no leverage. You know, so he got a huge percentage of all the Coke and beer sales and hot dog sales. He got the parking. He got, I mean, program sales. He got everything. I don't think Tampa got anything out of that
parking
stadium.
Even. I
He
mean,
got everything. He got everything.
That's what's funny to me to think about. Like, well, this was partly, it's got to be thought of as an infusion of, you know, of capital and a kind of like I don't know, an injection of life into the business world of Tampa. Yeah. And yet this guy's sort of like lapping up all those profits himself.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Tale as old as time, I guess.
And the city had no leverage. And not that, you know, once these NFL cities, I mean, some cities fight back and say, we're not building your stadium, and cities can leave and go to other suburbs. But Tampa in those days, it was a done deal. They're coming to the stadium. And what are you going to do? Say no to the new owner?
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were so happy to get the team and they gave him everything. And so what I was amazed at is he bought the franchise for $14 million, and it was over like 5 or 6 years. And he would get his cut of NFL properties. He'd get his cut of the new television contract. And I really think that after that first year, Hugh Culverhouse paid $0 of his own money. Just by owning that team, he got a cut of the new television contract.
Right.
You know, I don't know for a fact every bit, but in general, I don't believe that he paid much out of pocket.
Is this part of explaining the Bucs' early failures? Is understanding that they were owned by a guy that was just sort of like bilking the team and like
Yes. I mean, I live in Dallas and we have the Mavericks, and I like Luka Doncic, the basketball player. I study former Yugoslavia, so he's a Slovene. I like him, but I like Mark Cuban in that, yes, he meddles a bit, but he's a billionaire. He gives them whatever they want.
Right.
And he's making money, and fine, you want plush towels or you want catered food on the airplane. Who cares? He's a billionaire. Hugh Culverhouse wasn't. You know what I mean? And his money was tied up.
He's not liquid.
He wasn't liquid. And so I
was going to say, where are all the whirlpools and hot tubs and all the things I associate with like luxury and NFL now? Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example. When Culverhouse, now to finish with Bucko Bruce finally, they got the local cartoonist from the Tampa Tribune to do some designs. You know what I mean? And Lamar Sparkman was a great cartoonist, and he did great, you know, thousands and thousands of drawings. So I'm not saying he wasn't capable, but usually this is kind of a Madison Avenue kind of thing done in unison with the NFL.
Yeah.
You know what
I was going to say,
like,
you need like the people who create like Mickey Mouse and these sorts of things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even then, right? Let's talk to, you know, Roselle. Let's talk to New York about that. Let's go down the street to the newspaper. I don't even think they paid him. Who knows what they paid? You know, Sparkman didn't get much. And I know he didn't get residuals for the rest of his career. And he came up with some designs. And according to Bill Markham, who told me the first designs came back, and one was a hangman's noose.
Wow.
Yeah, that's not going to work in the South.
Yeah,
and
Jesus.
Tampa had problems with racism, and Florida had problems with racism. So that didn't work. And then they had, I never saw any of the original pictures. Bill Markham didn't have any, and I didn't have access to Bucs files. They weren't really crazy about a book called The Yucks.
I was going to say, like, is this the unofficial biography of the Tampa Bay Bucs? Yeah.
I don't even know if those exist, but I do know Bill told me that the other one was like Long John Silver. like a grizzled pirate, Captain Hook. And
they really wanted to go with a pirate type image, it seems like, for Tampa,
yes.
which is interesting to me.
Well, they couldn't go with like the eye patch because that was the Raiders.
Right.
The Raiders were litigious. And the owner of the Raiders, or the managing partner of the Raiders, Al Davis, hated Rozelle, hated the NFL, hated the merger. And the Raiders were like Dallas. They always had their middle fingers up. We're going to do what we want. And today, the Raiders and Dallas are not part of NFL properties. They can sell their shirts anywhere they want in the world, and they're not splitting the profits.
Interesting.
The other teams split it, 20, 30 ways. There's 32 teams. The Raiders were always like, F you. He personally hated Rozelle. So when the Bucs came in, Al Davis was like, if you even think about looking at all like my product, I'm going to sue the hell out of you.
Yeah, that makes
sense.
And
the league. And so the Bucs had to go in a different direction. And they decided to go, and they came back with like the Three Musketeers, D'Artagnan.
Yes.
In Tampa, they had this famous like fictional landing of Gaspar the pirate, Gasparilla. It's made up. It was made up about 100 years ago.
I was going to say, like, what is the origin of this? Because it ends up looking like almost like a Jack Sparrow, like a flamboyant pirate. Yeah,
Jack Sparrow, no eye patch.
Right.
And Tampa had this Gasparilla. Now it's this huge Mardi Gras like party that was essentially made up for a made up fictional pirate, and so it fit together, Gasparilla and the pirate ship.
Okay, yeah.
And it just kind of fit that we give him a slouch hat. And I have to say that the Bucko Bruce that Lamar Sparkman eventually showed up with was just great. I love Bucko Bruce. I love this design. Yeah,
I do too. I hadn't really like carefully, I didn't know what Bucko Bruce was until I started looking at your stuff. And the cover of your book.
Right? It's refreshing compared to so many boring, I don't know.
I love that he's winking. There's just something really cool about Bucko Bruce. And actually, I like it's funny because he didn't go with Madison Avenue, but I like the design. Like I like the draftsmanship of it. Like it's a cool logo.
And Sparkman was a great. I mean, I've known his work over the years from the Trib, and he was a cartoonist for 25 years and was phenomenal. Was really good at everything he did.
But answer me this: how long did Bucko Bruce last as the official logo? Because the Bucs don't have Bucko Bruce
well
anymore.
Into the mid to late 90s.
Wow.
Oh yeah. Bucs were tangerine, and so the colors, they had a design that was too close. So it was all like shoestring, not amateurish again, but just done locally. How about that? Done locally. And these knuckleheads got together and chose like teal and orange. And the NFL was like, "Listen, dumbasses, we have a team in Miami."
I was going to say that's the Dolphins uniform.
Exactly, and it was in the paper, and it just was like, "What is wrong with you?" And so they went back to and I interviewed another man who was a local printer. He's on the board.
But isn't there something cool about this? And I mean, I know this is your book in a lot of ways. This is the spirit of it, is that there's the locality or the localism of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the underdogness is part of the cement that like makes them popular.
Yep.
I mean, by the time one of my best friends, Curtis, in the world, I met him when we were both like 19 years old and working the same job in California. And I knew he was from Florida because he had a Tampa Bay Buccaneers hat on when I met him. And that was the first thing we talked about, was sort of his Tampa, like him being from Tampa and what that meant to him and how much the Bucs meant. As it's like the underdog thing seems like it's a really powerful, a powerful glue for putting together a kind of sense of community and a sense of like defensiveness about your shitty team.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. And so there was something local about it. And so all these, local VIPs, one guy was a lawyer. The one guy was a printer, but he was connected to all sports in town. And so Bill Markham was involved. They brought in all these people, and they were like, all right, let's do orange and honor the orange industry. And and then this printer looked at, there was an ABA, American Basketball Association team, Miami Floridians. What a bland name.
Jesus. The Miami Floridians. Yeah.
Come on.
The Los Angeles Californians. Yeah.
And that's why I love the Hurricanes and the Dolphins. Those are great names.
Sure.
But the Floridians was awful.
Oranges seem like a cliche of both Florida and California. I think a lot of
right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so they came up with a tangerine color that the Floridians wore. And you'll see that the Miami Heat, LeBron wore those colors one time in honor of the old Floridian team. It was like I don't even like a purplish, I don't even know what the word for it is, like an ugly purple and a tangerine put together. It was total 70s burnout, weird.
People love those throwback jerseys.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. And so they chose that combination, and then they added, I think, some red in there because they'd hired John McKay for USC, I believe. Anyway, they put it all together, and now they have a team. Now they have, and their first employee is this Bill Markham. Hugh Culverhouse is smart enough to hire Bill Markham, who has, at the time in 1974, a computerized list of all the people who attended his preseason games. Amazing. Bill Markham was smart enough to get their names and addresses. And so Hugh Culverhouse needed that list of 30,000 people to buy season tickets. And Hugh was cheap, incredibly cheap. He built a practice facility for the Buccaneers that was the same size, One Buck Place. They're still at One Buck Place, but they tore it down and built this awesome facility.
Right.
But the new Buccaneers weight room, the weight room is essentially the same size as the original Buccaneers place. The whole franchise was in a room that's the size of today's weight room. And so
things have changed.
Stucco. Oh, it was stucco. It was shitty. It was right near Tampa International Airport. So on their practice field, there's planes just flying in right next to them. No trees, no nothing, just a white stucco box. It's hideous. And he was so cheap. This Bill Markham told me, every day I learned something new that made, I just lost my shit. I couldn't believe how cheap he was. He bought a used couch for the entryway where you came into One Buck Place. He bought it from a local golf course. He bought a used couch. He didn't buy for the overhead projectors and film. He didn't buy screens. He just painted the walls white and was proud of it. You just show it on the white wall.
I can't imagine how demoralizing this is for players.
At first it wasn't. Then it became demoralizing. Then it became absolutely demoralizing, right? What else? Before One Buck Place was built, they have no employees. They have nothing. They had just gotten their design, Bucco Bruce, their colors. They have maybe 3 employees, right? A secretary, Bill Markham, and Hugh Culverhouse, who doesn't even live in Tampa yet. He's in Jacksonville. And so they opened their offices at like the Host Airport Hotel, just at the very beginning of the franchise. And Culverhouse comes in and they're having a meeting at the very beginning. There's no team yet, no schedule. This is 2 years before they're supposed to even be on the field. They don't have a coach. And they're meeting with the host manager, Host Hotels. And they're saying, we need so many plugs for printers. We need so much furniture. We need this and that. And he said, Culverhouse says, we're going to have a lot of mail coming out of here with your address on it. And I think you should pay for our letterhead.
Nice.
So a pro football team, he's saving what? $20 a ream, $10 a ream in 74, $5 a ream.
Well, one of the details that I read in your book that stuck out was him charging players for like 75-cent phone calls in hotel rooms and things like that. Like it just gets unbelievably petty.
Oh, incredible. And so as the team,
it's like working for any corporation, really. You're end up like the cost is on you.
So what then happens with the Buccaneers in the root of them being bad? First of all, they had this owner, and I'll explain in a second, but he eventually learns that you don't bring in, you don't sign, you trade away your draft picks because free agents might be costly, but they signed their contracts 3 years ago. And now contracts are going up, 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 up. You save money on bringing in this old guy and not paying a bonus to a new guy. Right. And so he learns that how to play with the contracts, and how to keep costs down, and while milking Tampa for the money, while spending nothing. And so in the meantime, the league comes up with rules for the Seattle Seahawks and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, these new teams, of draft picks. And they got extra picks at the end of each round. But the draft was notoriously weak in 76. They got Leroy Selman, the Hall of Famer, was their first pick, was phenomenal. One of the great Bucs is Selman Expressway. He was beloved. He died maybe 10 years ago, but just beloved in Tampa, and rightly so. A very kind-hearted, good man who spent his career doing good deeds, right? You want all athletes to be Leroy Selman. But apart from that, they didn't get much. And the rules essentially, they didn't give them free. There was no free agency yet. So you couldn't just sign players. When the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Carolina Panthers came in, they got an incredible number of extra picks. Then they had an entire pot of money to sign any free agents they wanted.
What is the philosophy when building the Tampa Bay Buccaneers team here in terms of what they're trying to do? Because it doesn't seem like they're trying to win, actually. It sounds like what they're trying to do is get the best bargain they possibly can.
Well, at first they were trying to win, but the rules were against them winning at all.
Okay.
Right. It was, one person described it as like fraternity hazing. You got to go through this if you want to be in the club. And other teams would point out, like Dallas won one game or tied one game in its first year, and the Vikings were horrible. Everybody was horrible. Like the best team ever won 3 games year one.
It's weird how the economics of sports work that way, where you expect an early a team franchise or expansion team to suck for a while, and it's just almost like the dues they have to pay. Yeah,
and it was dumb for the league. I mean, they learned their lesson later that the sooner you make Jacksonville and North in Carolina good, the better it is for everybody.
Right.
And they didn't do that in the beginning. And plus there was no free agency. There just wasn't. And so the Bucs couldn't get players.
Mm-hmm.
Teams just stockpile players. They had locked in salaries. Even if they eventually approved free agency, but if you left and went to another team, that team still was compensated for you. The commissioner would step in and say, fine, you're allowed to leave. But then the 49ers, you've got to give them a first-round draft pick.
And where are these players? Are these players coming from college? Is this where they're grabbing them from?
Well, the draft was out of college.
Right.
And the rest of the players were just cast-offs, has-beens, wannabes, guys that came over from the defunct World Football League, guys that came from the Canadian Football League. And so as the season started,
a motley crew,
very thin. They traded for Steve Spurrier, the great former Florida coach, that he becomes one of the great coaches in college football history. He was at the very end of his career and was at all-time. His entire career was spent on the bench of the 49ers. He never played. And he wanted to come home to Florida for his final couple years. Well, the Bucs brought him in, and he spent the whole season on his back, just getting killed. And so the Bucs didn't have any players. The ones they had were young. The league was brutal. Leroy Selman got hurt. And so the Bucs just got pounded into oblivion with no help from the NFL at all. The Seahawks too. I think the Seahawks won 2 games, and they had lucked into a running quarterback who could run for his life, Jim Zorn, and Steve Largent, a Hall of Fame receiver that fell into their lap. And so they were able to win 2 games.
Is this in the 76 season, the first
76 season? So that was Seattle, but the Bucs didn't have that luck. They had no luck.
And they become, for those that don't know, and this is sort of, I think, one of the reasons behind your book that makes it such a compelling story. And part of the reason I want to talk to you about it is how the Buccaneers, it's something, you hear about the 70s, and there's so many great cultural stories from the 70s. I feel like historians are going to still discover more and more weird shit that happened in the 70s. But I had not heard of this phenomenon that in 76, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers become a kind of national cultural joke. And Johnny Carson, who for young people that don't know, Johnny Carson hosted the Tonight Show and was a major voice, in American culture. Was making fun of the Bucs every night. And it became something that was how much is Johnny Carson and sort of making fun of the Bucs also making fun of Florida or making fun of Tampa or making fun of the South? It feels like that there's a sort of regional joke as well tied into it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the first thing was the league, and I'll come up with how they become icons of losing. The first thing is that the league doesn't allow them to win. It doesn't, and it's going to take years, like 4 or 5
because of the structure of
years.
the business.
The structure of the business, not going to win.
Mm-hmm.
Going to have to build through the draft, and the draft was not deep in 76, and it wasn't wildly deep in 77. So the Bucs are going to have to take their lumps. The second problem is John McKay, their coach from USC.
Yes.
And this is all going to add to this national.
He's a hilarious dude, by the way.
Oh, he is a former USC, Pat Hayden, friend of the family, his quarterback in 72 at USC, former athletic director of USC, part of the USC family, said John McKay wasn't a benevolent dictator. He was a dictator. Mike Garrett, another USC athletic director, won the Heisman, said he treated us all equally, black or white. He treated us like dirt.
Yeah.
And McKay was a do as I say, not as I do kind of coach, like Bobby Knight. He was antisocial. When he was in college, he got thrown off of Purdue for like trying to fight a coach, like Bobby Knight, like a great coach, but a total asshole.
Yeah.
Who the rules don't apply to him, but he's snarky. He's funny. He smokes cigars. He tells jokes to journalists who crowd around him. He loves to have drinks with journalists. He's great with one-liners. I mean, some of the best one-liners. One that I found out he never said, but everyone says he did, and it's totally John McKay, and it fits, was, what do you think of your team's execution, coach? And he says, I'm in favor of it. We can't win at home. We can't win on the road. What we need is a neutral site.
Which is such a funny callback to the origins of Tampa. Yeah.
Right. And he would throw players under the bus too. I mean, if you played poorly, he was going to take your head off. He would embarrass you in front of the fans, in front of the press, in front of your family. One time there was a kicker in the 80s named Bill Capice, poor bastard. He missed a couple field goals and they lost because of him. He was a kicker at Florida State. He was a pro kicker. He had a bad game. So what? Fine, cut him. You don't got to humiliate him. And he said, they asked about Bill Capice, and he said, Capice is kaput. You know what I mean? And
so they've got this. I mean, it's perfect. Like they have this. And you talk about Bad News Bears. I hope your book is a movie, because it's. I mean, it really is, or a Netflix series. It really. I mean, didn't they make a Laker? I feel like they made a Lakers one, a '70s.
Yeah, that's
Lakers
Perlman.
one.
That's Jeff Perlman, the Bo
right.
Jackson
Right.
player. Yeah.
But yeah, this cigar chomping asshole as their abusive coach is so perfect.
At USC, he would when they were always winning there, because he had 20 million people in the metro area to choose from. Always winning at USC. He won 3 or 4 titles. He had everybody there. He never had bad years. Ever.
Did he just hate being the coach at the Bucs?
Well, he hated losing, and his technique was, don't look at me. Those are the losers.
Wow.
That was
wow.
Right. I mean, he was I would have hated him as a coach, and a lot of the players did. A lot of the players hated McKay. They hated. I mean,
well, he said they suck all the time publicly.
All the time.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And he would belittle and demean you. One guy at practice was just kind of being nice, and McKay would always smoke cigars. He's like, man, that cigar smells. And he said, what'd you say? Get the fuck off my field, and cut him. One Buck, they were getting their asses handed to them by the Steelers the first season. The greatest team of all time is beating on the worst team of all time. This is that alone should be a documentary, that game.
Right.
And there was no hope they would win. It's towards the end of their year. The Steelers backed off, didn't stomp them like they could. It was like 42-0. It could have been 80. Seriously. And one player was seeing a buddy after the game, and they hugged, and he smiled, and the picture was in the paper, and he cut the guy for smiling.
Oh,
I mean, you're 0-9, dude.
Yeah.
This guy isn't a great pro, but that's the kind of person he was. He would, and he was very much the dictator of the team. He had assistants at USC, but also at the Bucs. They joked that his one assistant, they call him McKay's valet. He would pick him up every morning, take him to the bar, get his clothing ready, drive the golf cart around. And as the team would lose, the golf cart would be further and farther away from the field. McKay couldn't even look at those losers.
None of this helps. None of this helps with the sort of stereotype of the Florida team that's barely making it. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's just.
Here's McKay in terms of X's and O's.
Cartoonish image for sure.
Yes. And in turn, in terms of X's and O's, I didn't play football. I played basketball for years growing up, but I wasn't a football player. But I do know this, that McKay was very much old school conservative, and he had huge, very good linemen at Southern Cal, all Americans, some of the best linemen to ever play in the NFL. And then he had some of the best backs to ever. I mean, Ricky Bell, O.J. Simpson, Mike Garrett, Anthony something, these elite all-time greats. So you have these linemen, and they called it student body left, student body right. This is what he did at USC. Quarterbacks hardly threw the ball. They had big tight ends, big fullbacks, and they would pitch the ball, and OJ would run towards the student body, towards the sidelines, waiting for the blocks to develop.
Right.
And then he would turn upfield and just crush your ass. I mean, the linemen were already creating holes, and then OJ is 6'2", 230, and faster than you and stronger than you and tougher than you. So already at first, OJ would have 3 yards, then 4 yards. By the third quarter, 6 yards. By the fourth, he's running 100 yards down the field. And they beat your head in with the I formation, they called it, or in college, student body left, student body right, because you ran towards the student body.
Yeah.
Well, McKay was like, football's football. We're going to do this in the pros. Well, first of all, you're not going to have OJ anymore. Your linemen aren't as good as they were at USC oftentimes. And in the pros, the other team was a lot better than Stanford. It's a lot better than Cal, right? A lot better. And
it seems like your strategy has to match you say there's no OJ. Your strategy has to match the team you have.
Yes, and match the league as it is in front of you.
Yes.
Right. And so he was running this I formation with cast-offs, guys that other teams didn't want, third teamers from other teams, running backs from the World Football League that went defunct. Linemen towards the end of the year, they had a couple linemen that they pulled. They were like driving truck drivers, guys who had played football a year or two before. There were guys for the Bucs that year that played one game and would be cut and never played in the NFL again. Some guys played in that year. They were so hurt. For one thing, too, is not only were you not very good, but the I formation will beat your ass down. It's amazing that OJ doesn't have brain damage today, right? He probably does, but
maybe
who knows?
Maybe there's the reason behind the murders. We finally figured out,
right? But I mean, and so by the end of the year, they have no personnel, none, and they're pitching that damn ball, running into the line, and they're gaining 1 yard, half a yard, and pretty much it's predictable. Even when the Bucs started to win later, it was predictable. It was
Why aren't they changing the strategy? I guess that's my question, because I'm thinking about, like, in a lot of your in your narrative, I'm thinking about a movie I've seen too many times, Moneyball, with Brad Pitt, which is sort of like, about baseball, and it's about a much later era, and it's a different time in sports, obviously. But there's this sense of, like, they have this shitty team that they're trying to, like, work with, and at some point, I think Brad Pitt's character is like, we need to, like, basically approach the economics of this, and the strategy has to be combined with the economic part of it. We have to, in other words,
McKay was so hard-headed.
Right.
One of the great USC historians who writes all these books, Travers, I think, called him possibly clinically depressed. And so he was hard-headed and tough and mean, but also funny and gregarious. So he was a very complicated figure. After all that, I have to say, too, at times he was awesome, right? And so it was a wild mix without the personnel. And so whereas, like, Seattle told Jim Zorn, who became a pretty good pro quarterback, run like hell, brother, run. And that turned into 2 wins, 3 wins. They were able to eke something out. And McKay was always, I have to give him this. I mean, he was like WW2 generation. What's 2 wins mean to me? I'm not here for 2 wins. I'm not here for 5 wins. This will win if we get linemen, if we get backs, we get the right personnel. This will win. So I don't care if we lose every game, but he does.
I was gonna
Of
say, like
course,
the image that I have of John McKay is like a Curtis LeMay type figure, like with the
right?
cigar and everything. And you say
Yeah,
World War
right.
II, yeah, that's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
attitude.
And
It's like
just as hard headed too.
just fuck you, do it. We had to do
Yeah,
it, you do it. Yeah.
yeah. And so he in his defense, what did Seattle win? 2 games. We didn't win any. Are they any better than us? They barely beat us. We missed a field goal, right?
Did Seattle become a national joke in the same way though? Was Johnny Carson joking about Seattle?
And so as the Bucs start losing that year, and they start, Leroy Selman gets hurt, players are falling down. I think 1 or 2 Bucs finished the year that had been starters at the beginning. Right, everybody gets hurt.
Wow.
Oh, it's brutal. And so
that's
by the
high rate of attrition.
Well, by the end of the year, they lose every game. And so at first, Johnny Carson makes a few jokes, but it's expansion football, right? What do you expect with this team? All expansion teams stink. Well, then they start the next year, and McKay brings in his big back, a USC guy, Ricky Bell, he was a linebacker who turned into a running back, and he's just a killer. I mean, a great, tough. I think he was from like South Central, and so they start to run the ball. They get lucky. They sign this guy, Charlie Hanna. His brother, John Hanna, was one of the great linemen in history. Charlie Hanna never played line in his entire life, offensive line. And McKay said, you're going to be an offensive lineman. And it worked. And a few other losers who just worked out.
I hear the music starting to swell,
right?
And the montage is happening at this point. We're starting to come together.
Right. So they start to build a line. And in the meantime, they put together a ferocious defense. They have these 4 linebackers, including Leroy Selman's brother, Dewey. And they'd say, Leroy was a big, gentle giant. He'd knock you down and help you up. And they said the difference was Dewey would step on your head, that they were totally different. And they ended up getting these 4 linebackers, and not one of them ever became a superstar, but together they were, in those days, you could really take off somebody's head with an armbar. And these guys were brutal. And teams would play the Bucs, and they'd win 14-3 or 17-7. And coaches would say, they're getting better.
Yeah.
They don't have a quarterback. The line is still that, we know what they're going to do every damn play, but they're going to win. And you don't want it to be you. Right. Like people started to notice.
Eventually they're going to win a game.
They're going to win a game. And people start to notice that, we won 21-6, but they beat our ass. They brutalized us. They're playing rugby out there.
Right.
And, and John McKay, to his credit, is building this team, but he doesn't have a quarterback. He got rid of Spurrier. And he doesn't have any receivers. They're just bad. And, so Johnny Carson starts to mock them in season 2. And that's when Johnny Carson, I don't know the viewership numbers, but for those of you who don't remember Johnny Carson, he was Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon, and
there was no internet, so it's like everyone actually watched that stuff every night. Like it was.
He was all of them put together.
Yeah,
all of them put together.
Oh
that
big. It felt like you checked in with Johnny every night to see what was going on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and it came on right after your news, and a lot of people listened to his monologue and went to bed.
Yep, that was my parents.
By 11:45, time to go to bed. And he was funny. He really was a funny dude. And
I love Johnny clips. He was a total asshole too. Really funny guy. Yeah.
Yeah. And he would make fun of the Bucs, and that just entered the national consciousness. And then George Carlin and the local newspapers would make fun of the Bucs. Then
Carlin was fucking with the Bucs too.
Yes. Then the Bucs fans would wear bags on their heads, like the unknown comic from the Gong Show.
That's great. This is very 70s, by the way.
Yes. The Gong Show, one of the times that Chuck Barrett said, whoever wins the show tonight wins Buccaneer season tickets. Like that was the joke.
Right.
And so the fans started to put signs up on the 10-yard line that said, the Bucs stop here. And so you have hundreds of fans
on the 10-yard line.
Yeah. And then McKay's response to them was F you. If you don't like it, don't come. And, he was never politically savvy.
Right.
He was never media savvy in the way that My mother hated him.
Mm.
My mother growing up, he did a commercial. My mother, you could see her just seethe. She hated everything about John McKay.
That's interesting. Well, I mean, it's like he's kind of like the classic American patriarchal dude.
He was a bully.
Yeah,
he was
right.
a bully, and so everyone then starts to mac on the Bucs, right? And so by mid-season, the second year, I mean, they've lost 20 in a row. They had one game where they got like 1 foot a carry. You know what I mean? You just
they went nowhere.
Run into the line and fall down, and that was your play.
Wow.
And there were some games. There was one in there I remember. I think it was against the Chiefs. They had like 30 yards offense. Like it was one of the worst showings. While their defense is brutalizing the other team. There were a couple games that were like 9-3, and the other team was like, "Get on the damn plane, let's get out of here," because we were about to lose.
So they had a reputation for getting beat up.
Getting beat up, but also laying people out.
That's what I mean. I guess doing the beating up. They remind me of the Detroit Pistons as described in the 80s, as these guys are like throwing punches and stuff. I mean, it's like really, really brutal moment that's doing stuff that like I feel like major league sports players don't get away with anymore.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so Culverhouse, the owner, isn't yet wildly cheap because he's getting these guys. They're all from the draft, or they're all free agents that have been cast off. He doesn't have to pay anyone anything. Even Leroy Selman, I don't think he made over 200 6 or 7 years later. No one made any money.
Wow.
Now, and so Culverhouse didn't yet have to fleece the team at first because it was already as cheap as it could get.
Right.
So they're losing, and Culverhouse does stuff like One Buck Place was built by the owner of a hotel across the street. So the Bucs would stay in the hotel for their training camp, and the Bucs would pay for that in exchange for this hotel owner building them One Buck Place. So they're so fucking cheap.
Yeah.
They put a Coke machine in the locker room, and so there'd be reporters trying to ask questions, and these pro players would be like, "Hey man, you got a quarter?"
Charging
no
for
food
the vending
in the
machine.
Locker room, no drinks on ice, just water and water fountains. One player in the first year separated his shoulder, so they had to cut his jersey off. And when he got home, there was a bill for the jersey in his little cubby hole. They billed him for his jersey.
Yeah. Jesus.
Right. And so what then happens, the team they end up losing 26 games in a row. They lose the first 14 one year.
And no one has ever lost that. That's the longest losing streak in NFL
Longest
history.
losing streak in NFL history. But they were getting better. And I loved reading about it, reading between the lines, because there were coaches out there that were having bad years, and they were circling the Bucs game. Like, if I lose this game, I'm going to be on Carson.
That's amazing.
I will never work again.
Right.
I will be fired.
Like, it's like it's almost like this like sick lottery. Like, who's going to eventually they have to win a game, and I hope it's not us. Yeah.
Well, it's like a college coach losing to like Cal Poly.
Right.
You know what I mean? You're not working anymore, friend. And
Cal Poly, Pomona, or San Luis Obispo. I'm trying to
right, exactly. right. And so what then happens is the defense finally put it together, and they won their first game at New Orleans. The offense hardly scored. They just finally said, we're done losing. We're just going to brutalize these guys, and we're going to grab the ball ourselves and run into the end zone. So they intercepted passes. They picked up fumbles.
It's the defense that are the stars of this team. It seems like, yeah.
Oh, I mean, incredibly gifted and mean.
Gotta have that mean, yeah.
Right, and they'd lost so many. They'd fight on the airplane with the offense. They were so sick of the offense, and so anyway, they win, and then they come back their last home game. They've won one game, so they're 1-24. And they have one more home game, and they're playing the St. Louis Cardinals, who were a borderline playoff team. And they actually stomped them. The offense threw touchdowns, the defense stomped them, and the fans rushed the field and tore down the goalposts.
Wow. So, what a triumphant moment.
Oh my God. And the city, especially after the Saints game, they flew in, and like 4,000 or 5,000 people went to the airport to greet them. People were driving in from Orlando, 70 miles away. They were driving in from 100 miles away.
It's like, and now people will say they're from Tampa.
Yes.
Yeah.
And right. They arrive, and on top of the roof of, I think, one Buck place, if not right next door, the cheerleaders were on the roof and they're playing when the Saints go marching in, and the fans are buying ticket. They open the ticket windows because, of course, Culver House, and they sell out the next game. And they're stealing one of the places. People told me they were stealing grass, sod, for a piece of the moment, right? And,
sure, like the Berlin Wall. Like it's a piece of the Berlin Wall.
Yes, and John McKay came out later and said, I want to apologize for, I want to praise the Bucs for winning, that we're behind the Bucs. And he never really did those jokes again. But in losing 26 straight games, people in Tampa started to root for the Bucs. They really did. While they were horrifically losing, they actually sold more tickets. They became more and more popular, and people started to, it's funny, but there's something there. If we can get the right guys. And so what happens is they win and they exercise that demon. And I have to give it to John McKay that at his lowest point, fans hated him. His son, Rich McKay, became a great GM, built the Bucs to win the Super Bowl, was president of the Falcons. Rich McKay was in high school, and he said, I would go shopping for the family so nobody would see my parents.
Oh,
the fans would hang out at a steak and ale because it was dark, those old 70s. Yeah,
with the bags on their heads, yeah.
They would hang out and drink all night, and one of them said, we'd go home in the morning because that's when it was safe. We drink all night.
But it's so incredible, like psychologically, and with the history of the town, what becomes a city, that energy can turn, and that energy can turn into something that becomes like a source of intense like pride and strength for the city.
Well, and also too, no one was from there.
Yeah,
you had your original Latin families, some old white families, some cowboy, what they call old cracker families. Florida, the Florida settlers are known as crackers, not any kind of derogatory way. And you had a lot of that, but it wasn't a big place. And all these people are coming in from Minnesota and New York, and it's just Florida, where even today, I think, I don't know, it's 50%, 60% of the state is born outside of the state.
Well, one of these times you and I are going to have a conversation just about Florida and California, because I don't know Florida all that well. I know about it. I've read tons about it. I've only been there once, but California has a similar history in a lot of ways, right? As a sort of like this sunny place that people from other places end up showing up and building something. And it seems like there's a lot of
California, though, I think of youth. And when I think of Florida, I don't think of youth.
Right. And, there's the differences are stark as well.
Right.
For sure. Yeah. But I mean, even just like oranges as a symbol, and literally as a symbol of the people who are the real estate developers and the real promoters
and
that
Disney.
Are selling. Yeah.
And Disney.
There you go.
Well,
I mean, you know this as well as I do, that, when Disney was looking to make Disneyland, in the 1950s, he got professors from Stanford University to do like these long studies of where would be the perfect place to put this place. They chose Florida and California because they said these are places that have a year-round warm climate, and they're also places we see enormous population growth in the future.
That same Stanford Institute chose the top 4 NFL destinations when the Bucs came in.
There you go.
The same institute did the same studies. And so one thing about McKay, his hard-headedness, one, he was hilarious. And so he was the one too that kept them in the national news because he was so funny and he was not afraid.
Well, he's a kind of Trump-like character. It seems like there's something about him that you would want, not politically necessarily, although maybe, but I just mean in the sense of like a P.T. Barnum that you want to pay attention to. Yeah.
And so it was in the media as losers, but he always had good lines. And the one thing I have to say was Tampa in Florida was very racist historically. And he had no problem. I mean, it's the NFL in those days. All the teams are signing, whatever player will win, right? But McKay had no problem. And he signed Ricky Bell, his first pick, over Tony Dorsett. And Dorsett goes on to win a Super Bowl with Dallas and is all world. And Ricky Bell was so that first year because the Bucs were terrible. It's not his fault.
Right.
And they blamed him for it, blamed him for bringing in his own Southern Cal kid, blamed him for not bringing in the great Tony. As a kid, I remember we'd all go, you didn't get Tony Dorsett? What an idiot. Right. So people were mad. And equated into a lot of racial animosity towards Ricky Bell, towards the Selman brothers. They got death threats. They got watermelons mailed to the $1 place. Horrible shit. So chicken wings thrown on their lawns in a white suburb called Carrollwood. Horrible shit. That's offensive and awful that Tampa's white residents did. But really bad people. The average people there didn't do that. But McKay one time was coming off the field and the fans are, calling him every name. And someone called Ricky Bell the N-word. And McKay went into the crowd.
Interesting.
He's a 63-year-old coach, and he wanted a fist fight defending his 6'2", 230-pound stud. But, McKay was not going to put up with that.
That might be a little bit of that World War II thing, too. I
don't
want to speculate, but
much more liberal in many ways. And so what happens is in 78, he drafts Doug Williams, a black quarterback from Grambling. And so I was too young. I was born in 72, and I don't remember this first 76 team. But Doug Williams in the early 80s was my hero. When I thought of the Bucs wore white uniforms and they were black players. And my quarterback was black. Yeah. And I love that guy. And the only way that 7 and 8 and 9-year-old boys have a crush on their pro hero.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mine was Joe Montana.
There you go.
Yeah.
And Doug Williams, he came to my high school once to play in a charity basketball game. And he was signing autographs. And I just stood there. I just watched him sign autographs. I mean, he was tall, handsome, raw boned, thin and muscular. And that guy could wing the ball and was tough as nails. And they signed him and all of our heroes, Ricky Bell, Leroy Selman, Dewey Selman, Jimmy Giles, Doug Williams, were black. And they did more to move the needle in Tampa, in Hillsborough County, forcing people to come to terms with their racism, consciously or unconsciously, to root for the Bucs, because Williams comes in that first year right away. They're different. They've got their quarterback.
And he was, this is not an era where there's a lot of black quarterbacks, right?
None.
Right.
I mean, like 2 or 3.
Right.
There'd been like 2 or 3, and he was the first great one. And I wrote in the book that no, he wasn't Joe Montana, but for the Buccaneers, he sure as hell was Joe Montana. I mean, I think his record of the Bucs was like 30-30, but that alone was, Montana would have been 30-30. Steve Young was 1-15. Steve Young was the Bucs quarterback, and they said he could never play in them. Right. So Doug Williams was one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, and I refuse to have anyone can argue with me otherwise. No, he didn't have great numbers, and no, but he played for the Bucs.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good note to sort of wrap up a little bit, because it actually, to me, it corresponds so perfectly, and it rhymes so perfectly with the tone of your book, which is, the numbers. The numbers of wins and, that sort of thing, but also this sort of like other thing that football represents, and that sort of like social element.
Absolutely.
An economic element of building the city. Just like I said at the beginning, I don't mean to embarrass you, but I think your books are just so are so insightful in terms of connecting stories about football, the Olympics. We can get to that one eventually. We'll talk about your Sarajevo Olympics book. But I think you find stories that connect and connect them very well to all these other elements of them that they kind of like bring out what's important about them and why the Bucs matter.
To wrap it up, absolutely. So Tampa Bay embraces Doug Williams. They always embrace the Selmans. It's Leroy Selman Parkway in Tampa. I mean, he is loved. He's Babe Ruth of Tampa Bay.
Right.
And as a kid, they just kicked ass. And so they went from 2-24. They had 5 wins. Doug Williams broke his jaw, wired his jaw shut, and comes back the next year. And they not only make the playoffs, but they make it to the NFC Championship game, 1 game away from the Super Bowl. And I found the Bucs were so famously bad. And when they had the Iran hostages, I found this great line. Someone asked the reporter in Iran, what's going on in America? Who's in the Super Bowl? And the guy's like, well, it's the Rams and the Bucs versus the Steelers and, I don't know who in the playoffs. And he's like, the Bucs?
Yeah. Right.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Like he had gone into some other alternative reality while being a hostage. The Buccaneers are almost in the Super Bowl. And so they almost went to the Super Bowl, and John McKay did what he said he was going to do. And he did it fairly quickly, year 4, after losing 24 something games. So I give him all the credit in the world. It's after that the owner starts to play games, trading away draft picks because salaries are rising. The television contracts are rising. Get older guys. Don't sign the first rounders. Doug Williams, when his contract comes up, he's like, I think he was like 32 and 32, which was unbelievable. And he was like, there were 28 teams, and he was the 30th highest paid quarterback in the league.
Oof.
I mean,
yeah,
and so the USFL had started,
right.
And he took the contract he wanted and disappeared and showed up in 89 and won the Super Bowl for the Redskins.
Well, I mean, can you blame him for making that decision? Yeah.
Not at all. And so what happens is McKay gets old. He sees what the owner's doing, but he doesn't want to cross the owner who's paid him all this money, and he's just done. And so the Bucs start to lose. And then what Culverhouse does is he hires general managers who are utter yes men, who aren't trying to build winning teams. They're trying to do what the owner says at all times. Craven, they don't care about winning. They don't care about fans. And they start to lose. And they have some years in there, 1-15, 2-14. And it goes on and on and on until Culverhouse dies. And so that's really the history of the Bucs, that in the beginning, McKay set out to do what he's going to do. And in the process created Tampa Bay. I mean, the people in Tampa Bay became aware that they lived in, to have an NFL city meant you were a city. And it took all these disparate waterfront communities and suburbs like Brandon and Lakeland and, even Sarasota, put them all together and they never look back. That St. Pete and Tampa are big rivals all the time. They don't like each other, but it's Tampa Bay.
Yeah.
And the Bucs brought it. And now they've had multiple Super Bowls.
Mm-hmm.
Busch Gardens says, you look up Busch Gardens, it says Tampa Bay, Florida. That's a body of water, but Busch Gardens says we're in Tampa Bay.
Oh, yeah.
And,
well, it's the Tampa Bay Lightning. I was a big hockey fan, so when the NHL expanded and made the Mighty Ducks and the Tampa Bay Lightning in the late 90s, I remember that being just a sort of symbol of a certain kind of like that something has arrived here. For me, it was like hockey has become, popular.
They had a Bollywood award show?
In warm places. Yeah, that's right.
They had a Bollywood award show, and then they had the Republican National Convention in Tampa.
Right.
Which would have been shocking in another age.
But the Tampa Bay Lightning sucked so bad when they started. That was I was playing the NHL video games at the time, the EA Sports NHL games, and the Tampa Bay was always the worst team. I mean, the same with the Mighty Ducks, but they both has Tampa won a Stanley Cup?
Yes, several.
Yeah, they did, right? Yeah.
So the last thing I want to say is that the Bucs changed after Culverhouse died. They got a new owner, Glazer.
When was this, by the way? When did Culverhouse die?
Mid-90s.
Yeah, okay.
Mid-90s. He was WW2 generation. He was older.
Wow, yeah.
But they got Tony Dungy, who turned the team around. They got Derek Brooks, John Lynch, and Warren Sapp like in a 2-year period. Just some of the best players to ever play football. And Dungy turned the team around, and then they got John Gruden to finish the deal, and they won the Super Bowl. And I remember I was living in Ohio, and it was cold, and I remember opening my window and yelling into the night, like people I knew who were old Bucs fans. We got teary. And since then, I love the Bucs, but I don't really care anymore. They're not.
The curse was overcome.
The curse is over. I don't care if they're 0-16. They're not the Yucks. They will never be that.
Right. Yeah.
I look back at the articles, and there were all these old writers like, can you believe it? Can you believe it? I never thought I'd see this day. I never thought I'd live to see this. And that was the best.
Does it feel like a loss almost that like the Yucks are gone?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Like I've kind of been floating all these years. And when they won the Super Bowl 2 years ago, I was like, yay.
Yeah.
It didn't do it
all
for
right.
me.
Yeah. Good for you.
They're not the same.
That's so important, dude.
They're not.
I feel like that's such an important idea. Is that the Yucks would be the one that you would prefer? This sort of like losing team.
And I want Brady likes the old uniform, and he keeps saying he wants it back.
I think they might be that creamsicle uniform. When I was looking at stuff to record this podcast on Google,
they're going to wear it once or twice.
Yeah,
this year.
I think they're going to do throwback. Maybe we'll see Bucko Bruce come back too.
Yeah. Well, listen. Thank you. Sorry to go on so long.
No worries. I think I love the football stories, man, and I love that. To me, I'm not a huge football guy in the sense of like I don't watch football. But I feel like I know a lot about it. It just by osmosis. Right. And I think about it a lot in sports in general in terms of connecting to all the things we talk about on this show, capitalism, etc. Like that sports plays such an important role in it. I mean, just watch I mentioned the Dallas Cowboys, but we just watched the Raiders move to Vegas, right? And I go to Vegas quite a bit. I have family out there, and it's just it's such a different tone with that stadium there. I mean, it's a terrifying fucking stadium. The Raiders always scared the shit out of me. They're like, okay. When I worked at a sports bar when I was in my early 20s, they had to stop playing the Raiders games because of the crowd that was showing up. Just fucking rough
One
shit.
Buccaneer told me that Charlie Hanna was great, and he got traded to the Raiders in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And he said after being with Culverhouse and the Bucs through that shit show after they got bad, being there when they were good, and then when Culverhouse just wouldn't pay anyone, he's like, I got there and you could, after every home game, they would have picnic tables set up and cookouts. And it was like hippies and bikers and families. And it was like every Raider got to bring 5 people.
Right.
And it was like, you name it, and everyone had a good time. And he said at Christmas, Al Davis gave everybody a framed wrapped Christmas present, a framed photo of the Raiders team, and then a framed photo of your position players. And Charlie Hanna told me that he opened the lineman position player photo, and he looked at it and he started to cry. He's this big, huge football player. And he's like, I never received anything in Tampa. Not one thing, that he loved the Raiders so much.
That's the Raider Nation thing. I think that's part of what I wanted to talk with you about is how football stretches beyond football, right? And it becomes something about a town's pride and about people's pride. And Raider Nation here, I mean, even with them in Vegas, cars here in California, there are so many of them that are just covered. I just saw there's a Raiders mobile in my town. I see this guy. He has invested a lot into making his car into a fucking giant Raiders van. I mean, it's nuts, and the level of devotion does it interests me. It is connected to politics and everything else. So, Jason Vuic, you always make me think a lot. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, man. Thank you. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Well, okay, I think that's going to do it for today. I want to thank my guest, Jason Vuic. Go check out his book, The Yucks, 2 years in Tampa with the losingest team in NFL history. Super fun stuff and so detailed and insightful like all of Jason's books, which again, you can check out at jasonvuic.com, linked in the episode description. Thanks so much for being a Nostalgia Trap listener. And if you want to support our show and get access to all sorts of bonus stuff, including our live streams every week with Justin Rogers Cooper, do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And we will talk to you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.